The Curious Alien Student. The classroom on Starbase Orion was filled with students from different planets. Some had green skin, some had extra arms, and some, like Kylo, had smooth silver skin and large glowing eyes. Silo was from the planet Vorlax 7, a species known for their intelligence but completely lacking emotions. Unlike humans, his people never laughed, never cried, and never felt sadness or happiness. They simply existed, focused only on logic and reason. Tylo sat at his desk, listening as Professor Langston, a human teacher, spoke. Today's lesson was about emotions. A large holographic screen showed a video of a human woman sitting alone on a bench. Her face was buried in her hands, and water dripped from her eyes. Xylo tilted his head in confusion. Why was she leaking? Was she sick? Was something wrong with her body? Professor Langston's voice echoed in the room. This is called crying, he explained. Humans cry when they are sad, happy, or even when they feel pain. It is a natural emotional response. Silo turned to his human classmate, Ethan, who sat beside him. Ethan was always laughing, making jokes, and talking about things like friendship and memories. Things that made no sense to Silo. He leaned closer and whispered, "Why do humans leak water from their eyes?" Ethan blinked, then grinned. "You mean crying." Silo nodded. Ethan thought for a moment. It happens when we feel something really strongly, like when we're sad or really happy. Silo frowned. But that is illogical. Why would someone create water when they feel things? It serves no biological purpose. Ethan chuckled. Well, it's not about biology. It's about emotions. It helps us express what we feel. Xylo's confusion deepened. Express. What was there to express? Feelings were just random chemical reactions in the brain, weren't they? Why would anyone want to feel sadness on purpose? Just then, the screen changed. Another video played. A small child in a hospital bed, clutching the stuffed animal. A woman sat beside him, holding his hand. Tears streamed down her face. Silo felt something odd inside him. It was not sadness, because he did not understand what sadness was, but something uncomfortable. He raised his hand. "Professor, why is she crying? Is the child in pain?" The professor shook his head. "She is crying because she is afraid. She does not want to lose someone she loves." Love. Tylo's mind raced. He had heard humans use that word before, but his species had no concept of it. Yes, Professor Langston said, humans form strong connections. When they lose someone, it hurts. That's why they cry. Silo looked at Ethan again. "Have you ever cried?" Ethan's smile faded slightly. "Yeah. When my dog died last year." Silo tilted his head. "You cried over an animal." Ethan nodded. "Of course. I loved him. He was my best friend." Silo stared at him. How could someone feel so strongly about a creature that was not even the same species? It made no sense. His mind struggled to process this information. His people never loved. They never mourned. If someone from Vorlax 7 died, their body was simply removed, and life continued as usual. There was no grief, no sadness. It was efficient, logical, simple. But humans, they complicated everything. The lesson ended, and students started packing their things. But Silo couldn't stop thinking about it. This crying was more than just water leaving the eyes. It was connected to something deeper. As he and Ethan walked out of the classroom, Silo finally said, "I want to understand emotions." Ethan laughed. "That's gonna take a while, buddy." Silo narrowed his glowing eyes. "Then I will study them. If emotions exist, then there must be a logical explanation." Ethan shook his head. "Emotions don't work like math or science. You don't study them, you feel them." Silo didn't understand. But one thing was certain, he would find out. Whatever crying was, whatever love was, he would solve this mystery. He just didn't know that soon he would experience it for himself. Xylo's experiment. Silo could not stop thinking about crying. It was supposed to be a simple biological function, but nothing about it made sense. Why would humans willingly put themselves through sadness, fear, or even joy that caused their bodies to leak water? His people, the Vorlaxians, had evolved past emotions centuries ago. Their society was built on logic and efficiency. Emotions were seen as primitive distractions, unnecessary for progress. If a Vorlaxian child fell, they simply stood up. If one lost a family member, they moved on. No sadness, no joy, no regret. Yet, humans, they were different. Silo needed to understand them. Observing the humans. That night, in the quiet halls of Starbase Orion, Silo sat in his room, replaying the classroom video over and over. He examined the woman crying on the bench, the mother holding her sick child, the soldier embracing his family. The tears, the expressions, the way humans held each other when they felt something deeply. This is not logical, he whispered to himself. There had to be a reason. So, Silo decided to conduct an experiment. The next day, he began watching the humans more closely. He started with the cafeteria, where humans sat together, eating food and talking. He noticed that when they laughed, their eyes shined but did not leak water. Interesting. Later, he walked through the med bay. A young human had injured his arm during training. The doctor bandaged him, and tears welled up in his eyes. Pain caused tears. That was easy to understand. But then, he saw something that shocked him. A human girl sat alone near the observation deck, staring at a hologram of her family. She was not in pain. She was not hurt. And yet, tears silently rolled down her cheeks. Silo felt a strange unease. The girl wiped her face and whispered, "I miss them. Miss them." Silo had no word for this feeling in his language. How could someone feel sad about people who were not even there? He returned to his room, more confused than ever. Testing Ethan. Since observing wasn't enough, Silo decided to test emotions directly. He found Ethan in the common lounge watching a comedy video. He was laughing loudly, completely unaware of Silo's serious mission. "Ethan," Silo said, sitting beside him, "I need you to cry." Ethan choked on his drink. "Excuse me? I need to understand human emotions," Silo explained. "So I must witness a human crying." Ethan wiped his mouth, giving Silo a half-laugh, half-confused stare. "Dude, I don't just cry on command." Silo frowned. "Then what makes you cry?" Ethan thought for a moment. Sad movies. Memories? Pain? Losing something important." Silo nodded. "Good. We will begin immediately." Ethan groaned. "Oh no. This is gonna be weird, isn't it?" Experiment number 1. The sad story. Silo downloaded the saddest human story from the station's archives. A classic tragedy, about a man who loses everything and dies alone. As he read it aloud to Ethan, he watched closely. Ethan listened, but his expression barely changed. When Silo reached the final line, "And so he took his last breath, forgotten by all," he waited for tears. Nothing. Ethan yawned. "That was sad, but dude, I don't cry over stories like that." Silo narrowed his glowing eyes. Interesting. The content alone was not enough. Experiment number 2. The pain test. Next, Silo tried pain. He suggested that Ethan hit his own hand with a training baton. Ethan stared at him. "Are you serious? This is for science." Ethan sighed and tapped his knuckles lightly. "Oh," he said flatly. "No tears," Silo observed. "Of course not." Ethan shook his head. "Pain alone doesn't always make people cry." Silo made a note. Pain is not a guaranteed trigger. This was more complex than he thought. Experiment number 3. The emotional trigger. Silo needed a new strategy. He decided to use words, the way humans did. He needed to say something that would cause an emotional reaction. So, without thinking, he said, "Maybe your species is weak." Ethan's face changed instantly. His relaxed expression hardened. "What?" he said, his voice suddenly cold. Xylo continued, "Your emotions make you vulnerable. You allow them to control you. You cry over things that do not matter." Ethan's jaw clenched. His hands tightened into fists. For the first time, Xylo saw a new expression on his face. Not laughter, not curiosity, but hurt. "You don't get it," Ethan said, standing up. "Crying isn't weakness, Xylo. It's part of being human." He turned and walked away. Xylo sat there, frozen. Something inside him twisted uncomfortably. He had seen humans react this way before, but for the first time, he was the cause of it. An unfamiliar feeling. Xylo did not return to his room immediately. He remained seated, thinking. He had conducted an experiment, but he had not expected this reaction. His hands felt cold. His chest felt tight. He searched for an explanation. His AI assistant activated. "Your stress levels are elevated." Xylo frowned. "I am not stressed. Your body is showing signs of unease. The human term for this feeling is guilt." Xylo's glowing eyes widened. Guilt? That was an emotion. But Vorlaxians did not have emotions. It was not possible. And yet, he felt it. His mind raced. Could he have been wrong about emotions? Could he, a species with no feelings, be experiencing one for the first time? He needed to fix this. He needed to understand what he had just done. And for the first time in his life, Xylo felt something that no Vorlaxian had ever felt before. Regret. A test of friendship. Xylo had always believed emotions were unnecessary distractions, but now he wasn't so sure. The moment Ethan walked away, something shifted inside him. It was an unfamiliar weight, an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. His mind replayed the scene over and over. Ethan's face, the change in his voice, the way his posture stiffened before he left. Xylo had never seen him like that before. Had he damaged their friendship? No, that was illogical. Friendship was a concept based on mutual benefit, correct? Humans formed friendships the way his kind formed alliances, because it was useful. Yet, as the hours passed and Ethan did not return to their usual study table, Xylo found himself checking the time repeatedly. And the feeling in his chest, it did not go away. Analyzing the mistake. That night, Xylo reviewed his actions as though he were studying for an exam. He had conducted an experiment. The goal was to understand crying. He had tested pain, sadness, and personal emotions, but he had miscalculated the results. Instead of getting Ethan to cry, he had made him angry. Worse than that, he had made him hurt. And for the first time, Xylo realized he did not like this outcome. He pulled up an archive on human psychology. His AI assistant, NanoVA, scanned the results. Studies show that emotional pain can last longer than physical pain. NanoVA stated, humans value personal connections. Betrayal, rejection, or hurtful words can create lasting effects. Xylo tapped his fingers against the screen. But I did not betray him. I simply stated a fact. Incorrect, NanoVA replied. Your words implied inferiority. You questioned the strength of emotions, something humans deeply associate with their identity. Xylo frowned. So I made him feel less. Correct. Xylo shut the screen. This information did not sit well with him. He needed to fix this. The apology experiment. Xylo had never apologized before. Vorlaxians did not believe in apologies because mistakes were corrected, not regretted. If one made an error, they fixed it and moved on. But humans used apologies as a form of healing. So, the next morning, Xylo approached Ethan in the training center. The human was sitting alone, staring at his tablet, but not really reading. Xylo stood in front of him. Ethan, I must correct an error. Ethan looked up, eyes still holding traces of yesterday's hurt. "Oh, what error is that?" Xylo cleared his throat. He had rehearsed this sentence 23 times. "I did not mean to imply you are weak. I now understand that emotions are important to humans. I should not have dismissed them." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "So, you're apologizing?" Xylo hesitated. "Yes, that is the correct term." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. Then, to Xylo's surprise, a small smile appeared. "You really don't get how this works, do you?" Ethan shook his head. "But hey, that's the closest thing to an apology I've heard from you. So, I'll take it." Xylo felt the weight in his chest lessen slightly. Humans forgave. That was another concept he had not fully understood before. A new kind of experiment. After that, Xylo changed his approach. Instead of testing crying through controlled experiments, he decided to experience human emotions naturally. He followed Ethan to various places around the station, watching how humans interacted. In the rec room, he observed laughter, a human reaction to joy. He noted that laughter was often contagious. Even when people did not understand a joke, they sometimes laughed simply because others did. Why? In the mess hall, he saw comfort. When one human seemed sad, another would place a hand on their shoulder or offer kind words. It seemed to work better than logic alone. In the med bay, he watched a human hold another's hand while they were in pain. The injured one smiled weakly despite their suffering. Fascinating. But nothing puzzled Xylo more than music. One evening, Ethan invited him to a small concert held by the human students. Xylo almost declined, but curiosity got the better of him. A girl with long dark hair sat at a piano, her fingers moving gracefully across the keys. The melody was slow, gentle, almost sad. Then something inexplicable happened. Several humans in the room teared up. Some smiled through watery eyes. One person even closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Xylo felt his chest tighten again. He leaned toward Ethan. "Why are they crying? No one has died. No one is in pain." Ethan smiled slightly. "Music doesn't need a reason. Sometimes it just makes you feel things." Xylo frowned, but he did not ask further. Instead, he simply listened. The music touched something deep inside him, a place he did not fully understand. It was like an echo of something he had never felt before. And for the first time, Xylo wondered, would he ever be able to experience emotions the way humans did? The true test. Xylo believed he was making progress in understanding emotions. He had observed them, studied them, even felt small glimpses of them himself. But he had not yet faced the greatest test of all. A true emotional moment. One that would force him to either accept emotions or reject them completely. And that moment was coming sooner than he realized. Because soon, Ethan would leave. And Xylo would face something no Vorlaxian had ever experienced before. Loss. Xylo's first emotional experience. For the first time in his existence, Xylo was conflicted. The concept of emotions had once seemed like anomalies, biological errors that made humans unpredictable and inefficient. But now, after spending time with Ethan and observing human behavior, he realized emotions were not just random reactions. They were connections. They shaped the way humans interacted, remembered, and even made decisions. But even after all his observations, Xylo still believed one thing. He was different. Vorlaxians had never felt emotions. He had been raised in a world where logic always ruled, where bonds were formed based on practicality, not sentiment. Even if he understood emotions, he would never feel them himself. Or so he thought. The rift between them. Ethan had accepted Xylo's apology, but something between them had changed. Before, Ethan would always seek him out, asking him to join a game, inviting him to try new foods, laughing at jokes Xylo never quite understood. But now, Ethan was distant. He still sat next to Xylo in class, still spoke to him, but there was something missing in his tone. His laughter wasn't as warm. His conversations weren't as long. Silo noticed it immediately. He analyzed their previous interactions, comparing voice pitch, facial expressions, and word count. All signs pointed to one thing. Ethan was holding back. At first, Silo tried to ignore it. He told himself it did not matter. Humans were strange creatures. They often experience shifts in mood for no logical reason. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. Silo found himself checking the halls, wondering if Ethan would appear. He listened for his voice, even when he wasn't there. And when he was there but didn't talk much, Silo felt something off. Not pain, not discomfort, but a strange hollowness, like something was missing. But why? Was this related to emotions? The dream. A first for a Vorlaxian. One night, something even stranger happened. Silo dreamed. Vorlaxians rarely experience dreams, at least not like humans. Their minds were too structured, too focused on logic. But this was different. He was in a large, empty room. The walls stretched endlessly in all directions, and the only thing in the center was a single chair. Ethan sat on it, but he was facing away, his body unmoving. No laughter, no conversation, just silence. Silo took a step forward. His voice echoed. Ethan. No response. He took another step, but suddenly, the distance grew. The more he walked, the farther away Ethan seemed. Silo's chest tightened. His mind raced. Why was he moving away? Why couldn't he reach him? He tried again. Ethan. Still nothing. And then, Ethan simply vanished. Silo woke up immediately, his glowing eyes staring at the ceiling. His hands felt cold, his body tense. His first thought was not logical analysis. It was a single, simple realization. I do not want Ethan to disappear. Seeking answers. The next day, Silo went to the station's archives. He scanned thousands of human records, searching for an explanation of his experience. His search led him to an unfamiliar word. Loneliness. His fingers hovered over the screen. A state of emotional isolation, the feeling of missing someone or something deeply, often associated with bonds, friendships, and loss. Silo sat there, staring at the words. Missing someone. Loss. That was illogical. Ethan was still here. He was still alive. And yet, Silo felt as if something was already slipping away. Could it be that he was experiencing loneliness? Was that even possible for a Vorlaxian? The unspoken goodbye. Later that day, Silo found Ethan sitting by the observation deck, staring out at the stars. Silo approached, standing silently beside him. The vastness of space stretched before them. Endless galaxies, planets, and distant lights, twinkling like millions of possibilities. Finally, Silo spoke. Something is different between us. Ethan sighed, but he didn't deny it. I dunno, man, he said, running a hand through his hair. It's just, I guess I realize that you don't really see things the way I do. Silo frowned. That was always the case. Ethan chuckled, but it was not a happy sound. Yeah. But before, I thought you were trying to get it. Now I feel like you're just studying me. Studying him. The words hit Silo harder than expected. He had been so focused on understanding emotions scientifically that he had not considered something important. Ethan was not an experiment. He was a friend. And suddenly, Silo realized something terrifying. Friendship was not just a word. It was a connection, one that could be damaged. And worse, one that could be lost. The first tear. Silo opened his mouth to respond, but then Ethan said something unexpected. I'm leaving soon. Silo's mind froze. Leaving? Ethan nodded. My dad's being reassigned. We're moving to another sector. Silo stared at him. His vision blurred for a split second, as if the space around them had shifted. Leaving. Gone. Just like in his dream. You will not be here? Silo asked, his voice oddly quiet. Ethan shook his head. Nope. We leave in 2 weeks. Silo had never experienced shock before, but he imagined this must be what it felt like. For the first time, he realized the meaning of goodbye. And that was when it happened. A strange warmth built behind his eyes. His vision blurred slightly. His body tensed as an unfamiliar sensation overtook him. A single drop of liquid slid down his cheek. Tylo blinked. He touched his face, feeling the moisture against his fingers. Ethan's eyes widened. Tylo, you're crying. Silo stared at the tear on his fingertips, his mind unable to process what had just happened. He, a Vorlaxian, who had never felt emotions, had just leaked water from his eyes. Understanding humanity. Silo sat frozen, staring at the tear on his fingertip. It glistened under the soft artificial light of the observation deck, reflecting the countless stars beyond the glass. It was undeniable. He, a Vorlaxian, a member of a race that had long abandoned emotions, had just cried. A single drop, but it was real. His mind raced to analyze the sensation. His vision had blurred, his chest had tightened, and something inside him had felt heavy. It wasn't pain. It wasn't sickness. It was something entirely new. Across from him, Ethan watched in shock, his mouth slightly open. Dude, you just cried. Silo's fingers curled around the tear as if trying to capture the moment before it disappeared. I do not understand. His voice was quiet, uncertain. This should not be possible. Ethan leaned forward, his expression softening. You felt something, Tylo. That's what crying is. It's when emotions get so strong, they come out. You're feeling something right now, aren't you? Silo hesitated. He had never struggled to find words before, but now they refused to form. Finally, he said, You are leaving. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Silo looked away, his hands tightening into fists. I do not want that. It was the closest thing to an admission of feeling that he had ever spoken. Ethan let out a slow breath. That's what emotions do, man. They make us care. They make goodbyes hard. Silo's mind processed this. It was not just about words or scientific study. It was something deeper, something that existed beyond logic. The realization hit him harder than anything ever had before. This was what it meant to be human. Memories in the making. Over the next few days, Silo found himself doing something strange. He was paying attention to the little things. He noticed the way Ethan's laughter sounded different depending on the situation. Sometimes loud and carefree, other times soft and thoughtful. He noticed the way humans touched each other when they spoke, a hand on the shoulder, a playful nudge, a hug when someone needed comfort. He noticed that when Ethan told stories about his family, there was always a certain warmth in his voice, a connection to the past that Silo had never understood before. These small moments were not just data. They were not just observations. They were pieces of something bigger, something Ethan would take with him when he left, and something Silo would be left without. The thought made the strange hollowness inside him grow stronger. Was this what loss felt like? A lesson in emotion. A week before Ethan was scheduled to leave, Silo decided he needed more answers. So he sought out Professor Langston, the human instructor who had first introduced him to the concept of emotions. He found the professor in his office, surrounded by books and holographic research screens. Silo did not waste time. Professor, I require information. Langston raised an eyebrow. All right. About what? Silo's glowing eyes locked onto his. How do humans deal with emotions? The professor leaned back, tapping his fingers on his desk. That's a broad question, Tylo. I require a broad answer. Langston smiled slightly. All right, let me ask you this. What's making you think about this? Silo hesitated, but then he said, My friend, Ethan, is leaving. Langston nodded slowly. And how does that make you feel? I do not want him to leave, Silo admitted, but I cannot change that. Langston sighed. That's what makes emotions hard. Sometimes, there's nothing you can do to stop something painful from happening. You just have to feel it. Silo frowned. That is not an efficient solution. The professor chuckled. No, it's not. But it's the truth. Emotions aren't meant to be solved, Silo. They're meant to be experienced. Silo let those words sink in. Emotions were not equations. They were not problems to be fixed. They were life itself. And for the first time, he did not fight the feeling inside him. He simply let it exist. The gift of a human. The night before Ethan was scheduled to leave, Silo found him on the observation deck again. This time, Silo did not hesitate. He sat beside him and placed something small in Ethan's hand. Ethan looked down in surprise. What's this? It was a small holographic cube, programmed with Silo's recorded memories. The times they had spent together, the conversations they had shared, the places they had explored. Silo did not know why he had made it. He only knew that he wanted Ethan to have it. Ethan turned it over in his hands, his expression unreadable. You made this. Silo nodded. I do not know if this is the correct way to say goodbye, but I wanted you to have something, so that you remember. Ethan swallowed, staring at the cube for a long moment. Then, to Silo's surprise, his eyes glistened with moisture. Silo. He smiled, shaking his head. You really don't get it, do you? Silo blinked. Get what? Ethan chuckled softly. I'm not gonna forget you, man. That's not how friendships work. Silo felt a strange warmth in his chest. So this was what it meant to be remembered. He had not just learned about emotions. He had become a part of them. The goodbye that wasn't really goodbye. The next day, when Ethan's ship was preparing to leave, Silo stood among the crowd, watching him walk toward the boarding ramp. Ethan turned one last time. And without hesitation, he did something very human. He pulled Silo into a hug. At first, Silo stiffened, unsure how to respond. But then, slowly, he lifted his arms and returned the gesture. No words were needed. And when Ethan finally stepped onto the ship and the doors closed behind him, Silo did not run calculations. He did not analyze the moment as data. He simply felt it. And as the ship disappeared into the vastness of space, Silo touched his chest. The feeling was still there. Not pain, not regret, but something deeper, something human. And he knew this was only the beginning, the ultimate test, a goodbye. The station felt emptier without Ethan. Silo never thought he would care about such things. The volume of human interactions in the common areas remained unchanged. The lessons continued. The station's humming machinery functioned as usual. And yet, something was missing. Not a person, not an object, but a presence. His daily routine remained the same. He still attended classes, still studied human behavior, still completed his assignments with Vorlaxian efficiency. But when he walked into the cafeteria, Ethan wasn't there to push a tray of unfamiliar human food toward him with a grin. When he passed the rec room, there was no sound of Ethan laughing at some strange Earth joke. When he sat in their usual spot on the observation deck, the seat beside him remained empty. For the first time in his life, Silo understood silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of someone who mattered. Understanding the absence, Silo had been taught that everything in the universe followed patterns. Vorlaxians did not form emotional attachments because logic dictated that people came and went. No single individual was more important than the function of the whole. But humans felt the absence of people deeply. They carried those who left inside them, like echoes in their memories. Ethan had only been gone for 3 days, but already, Silo could feel his influence lingering. He found himself pausing before responding to things, remembering how Ethan would have answered. He found himself listening to the music Ethan had introduced him to, not for scientific study, but simply because it felt familiar. He even found himself reacting differently, noticing emotions in others more, responding with more care instead of just observation. And perhaps the strangest thing of all, he missed the sound of laughter. A message from a friend. On the 5th day after Ethan's departure, Kylo received a message transmission. It was from Ethan. His heart rate increased slightly, a physiological reaction he had never experienced before. He opened the message, and a hologram projection of Ethan appeared. His friend looked the same, messy hair, casual grin, but there was something different in his eyes. "Hey, Kylo." Ethan's voice filled the room, and it was strange how much Kylo had missed that sound. "I just wanted to check in. You're probably still overanalyzing emotions like there's some complicated science project, huh?" He chuckled. "I bet you've already made 50 data logs about missing people and human attachment bonds." Kylo felt his lips twitch into what humans call a smile. "But hey, I hope you know now that it's not just about logic. Missing someone isn't a weakness. It just means they were important to you." Ethan paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "I dunno if Orlaxians do friendships the same way humans do, but just so you know, you were one of my best friends, Kylo." Kylo froze. The words hit him in a way he did not expect. Best friend. That was a human term, one that meant something powerful. "I'm sending you this because I don't want you to just file me away as a past experiment, all right?" Ethan smirked. "So don't go all robotic on me." There was a small silence before Ethan continued, his voice softer. "You're different now. I could see it before I left. And that's not a bad thing." Another pause. Then, finally, "I'll see you again someday, all right? Take care, Kylo." The hologram faded. Kylo sat completely still. His mind and body were at war. He had felt something again. But this time, he did not push it aside. He did not analyze it or try to explain it away. He simply let it exist. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to care about someone. A test unlike any other. That night, Kylo could not sleep. His mind kept returning to one question. What now? He had spent so much time studying emotions, trying to understand them, trying to explain them. But emotions were not meant to be explained. They were meant to be lived. Ethan was gone, but he had left behind something more powerful than his physical presence. A connection, a bond, a part of himself that still existed in Kylo's mind. And suddenly, for the first time, Kylo realized he was no longer just Forlaxian. Something in him had changed forever. He had taken his first steps into something new. Not just knowledge, but understanding. The final test, a human goodbye. The next morning, Kylo did something he had never done before. He walked to the observation deck, sat in his usual spot, and closed his eyes. Not to calculate, not to analyze, but to remember. He thought about all the moments with Ethan. The jokes, the lessons, the arguments, the moments of discovery. And finally, for the second time in his life, a single tear rolled down his cheek. But this time, he did not fight it. Because he understood now. It was not weakness. It was proof. Proof that emotions were not a flaw. They were the greatest strength in the universe. The birth of something new. For the first time in his life, Kylo felt human. Not in the biological sense. His silver skin still reflected the station's artificial light, and his glowing eyes remained distinctly Forlaxian. But inside, something had changed. The empty space where emotions had once been considered illogical distractions was now filled with something deeper, something real. He had cried. He had felt. He had lost something, and yet gained something far greater. He was no longer just an observer of emotions. He was now a part of them. A new purpose. Kylo stood before the large observation window, staring at the endless abyss of space. Ethan's ship had vanished into the darkness days ago, but the echo of his presence remained. Silo touched his chest, the place where emotions now lived. For weeks, he had treated human emotions like a puzzle to be solved, an equation to be balanced. But emotions were not a science. They were not data points on a graph. They were experiences. And now, Silo understood something that no Vorlaxian ever had before. His people had spent centuries erasing emotions from their existence, believing it made them stronger. But perhaps they had been wrong. Perhaps feeling was not a weakness, but a power unlike any other. And if that was true, then he could not keep this knowledge to himself. The first step toward change. Determined, Silo made his way to Professor Langston's office. The human teacher had been the first to introduce him to emotions. If there was anyone who could guide him, it was him. The professor looked up as Silo entered. "Ah, Silo, what brings you here?" Silo did not hesitate. "I need your assistance." Langston raised an eyebrow. "With what?" Silo took a breath. A completely unnecessary biological function for his species, yet one that now felt natural. "I want to understand emotions, not just for myself, but for my people." The professor blinked. Then he leaned back in his chair, studying Silo with curiosity. "You want to bring emotions to the Vorlaxians?" Silo nodded. "I do not know if it is possible. But if I can learn, then perhaps others can, too." Langston folded his hands, deep in thought. Then he smiled. "Well, Silo, looks like you found yourself a real mission." And for the first time, Silo did not see it as an experiment. This was something greater, a friend's legacy. Later that night, Silo activated the holographic cube he had given to Ethan before he left. The memories flickered in the air before him. Images of Ethan laughing, teasing, teaching. Moments of shared discovery, of frustration, of understanding. Silo reached out, his fingers brushing through the glowing images. Ethan had changed him. And now he would use that change to inspire others. He had spent so long fearing the idea of emotions, believing them to be illogical weaknesses. But emotions had given him something that no amount of intelligence or knowledge ever could. They had given him connection, a bond so powerful that it had transcended the limits of his species, a friendship that did not end, even across the vastness of space. And as Silo watched the flickering hologram, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.